She just wanted to help out and clean out her grandfather's old garage after his death. But under a dusty cover, the granddaughter found something that changed her life forever. Imagine uncovering a family secret so massive, it rewrites everything you thought you knew. Would you be ready for that? Relatives laughed at the old man and called him a nobody. But what he had kept secret for many years shocked everyone. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video. The house smelled of dust and faded flowers, a mixture of time and memory that clung to the air in every corner. For weeks she had been coming and going, caring for her grandfather in his final days, watching the man who had once been strong and steady begin to fade, his voice thinning into whispers, his hands trembling with each breath. He never asked for much, never complained, though it was clear to her how much pain he carried in his body. His eyes remained gentle even when his frame grew weak. And when he looked at her, it was as if all the years of his life, the struggles, the sacrifices, the disappointments were condensed into that gaze. He seemed to say without speaking that she was the only one who truly saw him, the only one who remained. The rest of the family had drifted away long before. Some had moved to different cities. Some claimed to be too busy. Others had decided long ago that he was no longer worth their time. They called him stubborn, outdated, a burden. And in their eyes, he was nothing but a shell of a man waiting to disappear. In whispered conversations, they laughed about him, saying he had wasted his life on useless tinkering, on dreams that never amounted to anything. None of them came to sit by his bed. None of them came to hold his hand in the evenings when he struggled to breathe. None of them saw the quiet dignity in the way he faced the end. She saw it. She felt it. And though her heart broke every night she left his room, she also carried a strange pride, as if being chosen to walk with him to the very edge of life was an honor no one else had the courage to accept. She was his only granddaughter, the only one who had always felt close to him. From childhood, she remembered sitting on his knee, listening to stories that seemed strange and fragmented, as if he had lived lives no one else could imagine. Even then, he was private, always holding something back. But she knew his love. She had always known that. When the end finally came, it was a quiet morning. The sun barely touched the curtains, and the house seemed still, as though it understood what was about to happen. She was there, holding his hand, feeling the frailty of his skin, the shallow pull of air in his chest. He looked at her once more, his eyes glistening, and then he was gone. It was not dramatic, not loud. It was a whisper, a slow slipping away, and suddenly the silence of the room deepened in a way she had never known. The days that followed were a blur. She made the calls, arranged the service, signed the papers. The funeral home demanded money she barely had. The casket, the flowers, the plot in the cemetery, all of it fell to her because no one else would step forward. She dipped into what little savings she had, knowing she was emptying her future to give him peace in the present. When she reached out to her relatives, hoping perhaps someone might share the burden, they mocked her. "Why waste so much?" they said. "He's gone. He doesn't need it." Some even laughed openly, asking why she would spend her hard-earned money on an old man who, in their eyes, had never accomplished anything. The cruelty of it cut her, but she said nothing. She had long since stopped expecting kindness from them. The day of the funeral arrived. A gray sky hung low, the air damp and cool. Only a handful of neighbors came, people who had known him in passing, who remembered his quiet greetings or the way he once helped fix a broken fence without being asked. The family did not come. Not one of them stood by her side as she lowered him into the earth. She felt as if she were carrying not only his coffin, but the weight of his entire life, and that burden pressed down until she thought she might break. Yet she stood tall, her hands trembling as she held a small bouquet of flowers she had bought herself, the last gift she could give him. As the dirt fell, she closed her eyes and whispered a promise that no one else could hear. She promised that he would not be forgotten, that she would remember him not as the bitter words of the others painted him, but as a man who had taught her quiet strength. Tears burned her face, but inside there was also something steadier, a core that would not collapse no matter how much loneliness surrounded her. Afterward, she walked home alone. The streets felt empty, every shadow echoing her loss. Her body ached with exhaustion, her wallet was nearly empty, and her soul felt drained. Yet she knew she had done what was right. She had given him the dignity he deserved, even if the world thought it foolish. She collapsed into bed that night, her clothes still smelling of damp earth, her mind turning over memories of his voice, his laugh, his silence. But grief is not a single wave. It lingers, returns, reshapes itself. The following week she found herself wandering the rooms of his house, touching the walls, the furniture, the little things he had left behind. It was as if each object whispered to her fragments of a story unfinished. The others had told her to empty it quickly, to sell what she could, to leave behind the weight of the past, but she could not. She felt the need to walk through it all slowly to honor him by acknowledging the life he had lived. And so, though her pockets were empty and her heart heavy, she stayed. She sat in his chair, smelling the faint scent of his clothes. She opened his books, seeing his handwriting in the margins. She held photographs of people long gone, wondering what secrets were hidden in their faces. The silence of the house pressed on her, but it was not only sorrow, it was also presence. He was still there in every corner, and she could not let go. It was in those days when she lingered between grief and duty that the thought of the garage began to press upon her. The garage had always been his space, locked and shadowed, filled with things he never allowed anyone to touch. She remembered as a child trying to peek through the crack in the door, seeing only shapes and tools, but her grandfather would gently but firmly close it, telling her that some places were meant to be left alone. Now that he was gone, the garage stood silent, the lock rusting, the air heavy with dust. She told herself she would go there, that she would face whatever was hidden. But not yet. Not while the grief was still raw. For now she sat in the house remembering him, remembering the way he carried himself even when no one else respected him. She thought of the way he endured the sneers, the way he never retaliated when others mocked him. She thought of how he had carried secrets in his eyes, things he never shared, things she now wondered if she might one day uncover. What if the biggest shock was still hiding in plain sight, waiting to flip her world upside down? The first chapter of his absence had closed with the funeral, but she knew another was waiting. The house was not finished speaking. The walls were not done whispering. And somewhere in the shadow of that untouched garage, something of him still lingered. She could feel it, though she did not yet know what it was. Her life had been emptied, her pockets drained, her heart scarred by the cruelty of those who should have stood with her. But she was still here. She was still standing. And in the silence of her grandfather's house, she understood that though the world had abandoned him, she had not. She never would. And so with quiet determination, she rose from the chair, wiped her eyes, and whispered to the empty room, "I'll take care of it. All of it. The house, the memories, the secrets. Whatever he had left behind was now hers to face." And though the road ahead looked heavy, she felt a flicker of something deep inside. It was not hope exactly, but a spark, something that told her the story was not finished, that the man everyone dismissed had left behind more than they could ever imagine. The week after the funeral passed in a haze of exhaustion. Her body moved as though through heavy water, each step dragging, each breath thickened by grief. Yet the world outside had already gone on. Neighbors walked their dogs. Buses roared past. Children shouted in the distance as though nothing had changed for her. Everything had changed. The one man who had always seen her, who never doubted her place in his life was gone, and the silence he left behind weighed on her shoulders more than any burden she had ever known. She kept returning to his house, unable to stay away, unable to leave it behind. It felt wrong to let it sit alone, as though he were still waiting there for someone to tend to it. The moment she opened the door, the air of the place struck her. It was thick with dust, but not unpleasant, familiar, the scent of old wood and books, of cooking long past, a fabric that had absorbed years of living. The house was not just empty. It was filled with absence. Each room echoed, not only with silence, but with traces of him. A chair pushed slightly back from the table, a cup still in the cabinet that only he ever used. The slippers by the bed that would never again be warmed by his feet. She felt her chest tighten at the sight of these things, and for a moment she wanted to flee, to shut the door behind her and pretend it was someone else's burden. But she could not. She had promised herself she would take care of everything. And though her hands trembled, she stepped further inside. The house had always been modest, yet it seemed larger now, more cavernous, each shadow stretched longer without his presence. She moved slowly, her fingers brushing along the walls, as though she could catch a glimpse of him in the texture of the paint. In the living room, the old clock ticked on, unaware that time had stopped for the man it had measured life for. She sat in his chair and felt the indentation his body had left in the cushions, the silent testimony of years. It was as if the fabric itself still held his weight, his warmth, his shape. She closed her eyes, and for an instant she could almost imagine he was in the next room, about to appear. But when she opened them, the stillness remained unbroken. The more she looked around, the more she realized how much of him lingered in small, ordinary details. The books on the shelves carried not just stories but his notes scribbled in the margins in a hand that had grown shaky with age but remained sharp with thought. She pulled one down at random and saw underlined passages, small comments in the margins that revealed a mind still alive with curiosity. In the kitchen she found jars of spices lined up neatly, some so old their labels had faded. She remembered how he once told her that flavor mattered, that even when you had little, you could still create richness. In the bedroom, she opened drawers and found clothes folded with care, though worn and frayed. Each room was like a fragment of a story, pieces of a life that had never been flashy or admired, but was layered, textured, and real. As she wandered, she felt the presence of her family again. Not here physically, but in the way they had spoken of him, dismissive and cruel. Their voices returned in her head, the laughter, the scorn. Why waste money on him? Why bother? He never amounted to anything. She clenched her fists as she stood in the middle of his kitchen, staring at the table where he used to sit with a cup of tea. They had never seen this, the quiet strength, the simple dignity of a man who had lived honestly. They had only seen what they wanted to see. A poor old man with nothing left to give. They were wrong. She knew it. And somewhere deep in her chest, the determination to prove it began to grow. But anger would not clean the house. She had work to do, and though no one else would ever join her, she resolved to do it herself. She began in the living room, gathering dust rags, opening windows to let in the cool air. As she worked, she felt a strange mix of sorrow and peace. It was hard to be surrounded by so many reminders, yet it was also comforting. Each item she touched connected her to him, as though by cleaning and ordering his things, she was keeping him alive in some small way. Hours passed. She stacked books, polished the surfaces of tables, sorted through piles of papers. Some she kept, slipping them into a box she labeled for herself. Letters, notes, photographs. Others she reluctantly placed into bags, things that had no meaning beyond their use. Each decision was painful, a question of what to hold on to, what to let go. The house resisted being emptied, its corners stubbornly clinging to fragments of him, but slowly she made progress. It was when she entered the small study that she felt the weight of memory most heavily. The desk was still covered with loose papers, diagrams, and a few old tools. She sat down in the chair and opened the drawers one by one. Inside she found notebooks filled with sketches, equations, and notes that made little sense to her, but seemed important, precise, the kind of work of a man who thought deeply about the world. She turned the pages slowly, imagining him sitting there at night, writing by lamplight when no one else was around. She had never known this side of him, this quiet pursuit of knowledge, hidden away as though it were his private treasure. It struck her then how much of him had been unseen. To the outside world, even to his own children, he was just an old man who had lived past his usefulness. But here was proof of a mind that never stopped working, of a man who still dreamed and created long after others had dismissed him. She closed the notebook with reverence, as though she were handling something sacred. By the time evening came, she was exhausted. The light through the windows had dimmed, casting long shadows across the floor. She sank into his chair again, her hands aching, her clothes covered in dust, but her heart steadier. The house was not empty. It was full of him in every corner, every drawer, every faded object, and she knew she could not leave it behind quickly as the others demanded. She would take her time, go room by room, give every piece of his life the respect he deserved. Her eyes wandered then toward the back door where the garage stood. The thought of it made her pause. The garage had always been a mystery, locked away, forbidden. She remembered as a child standing outside its door, curious about the clanging sounds and the smell of oil that drifted from within. He never let her in, always guarding it as though it contained something too important or too private to share. Now the door stood shut, the key somewhere in the house waiting for her. She was not ready yet. The house alone had drained her, and the garage carried an air of something heavier, something secret. Still, she felt the pull of it, like a shadow at the edge of her vision. Whatever lay inside would have to be faced, and she sensed it was there that she might find the answers to questions she had never asked. But tonight she simply sat, letting the quiet fill her ears, breathing in the familiar scent of the place. The house was empty, but not lifeless. It was heavy with stories with the essence of the man who had lived here, and she felt both crushed and strengthened by it. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself that she would keep going, that she would uncover it all piece by piece. The silence offered no reply, but deep in her chest she felt something stir, as though the house itself approved. And so the night settled around her, the ticking clock marking time, and she sat in the stillness, gathering the courage she would soon need. The house had given her its memories, its fragments of the man she loved. The garage still waited, locked and silent, its secrets hidden beneath dust and shadows. One day soon, she would open it. One day soon, she would learn what he had kept from the world. The next morning came with pale light streaming through the windows of the house, illuminating the dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. She had not slept much, her mind too restless, weighed down by the silence of the rooms and the feeling that the house was watching her, waiting for her to discover something more. When she rose from the couch where she had collapsed the night before, her body ached from the hours of cleaning. Yet her determination was still firm. She had promised herself she would not abandon the house, that she would preserve every fragment of her grandfather's life. It was not only a duty, but a calling, as if he had left her a task she alone could fulfill. She made her way back to the study. The room had unsettled her the day before with its drawers full of sketches and papers, its aura of secrets kept quiet for decades. Now, in the morning light, it seemed almost alive, the papers scattered across the desk, glowing faintly, as though they carried their own quiet fire. She pulled the chair back and sat down, running her fingers along the edges of the notebooks. One by one she opened them, breathing in the faint scent of aged paper and ink. The handwriting was unmistakably his, strong and earlier pages, then slowly giving way to the shakiness of his final years. The words she found inside were not the ramblings of an idle old man. They were precise, meticulous, often filled with technical detail she could not fully grasp. There were diagrams of machines, calculations written in neat lines, sketches of engines, and even notes about rare car models that she recognized only vaguely from magazines or films. At first, she thought it might be fragments of a hobby, something he had done to pass the time. But the more she read, the clearer it became that this was not mere pastime. This had been his life's work, hidden away in plain sight. She thought back to how her relatives had spoken of him, dismissing him as a man who had wasted his years tinkering with junk, too proud to let go of his illusions. Yet here, laid out before her, was evidence that he had once walked among people who respected and valued such knowledge. He had not been a fool, as they claimed. He had been a craftsman, a thinker, perhaps even a visionary. A pang of sorrow struck her as she realized how invisible all this had been to the people who should have known him best. She pulled open another drawer, finding more than just papers. There were letters yellowed with age, folded carefully, and tied with string. Her hands trembled as she untied the knot and spread the pages on the desk. Some were from colleagues written decades ago, speaking of projects they had worked on together, of opportunities lost, of dreams pursued. Others were thank you notes from people he had helped in small but significant ways. Reading them, she could almost hear his voice, quiet and steady, offering advice or guidance, never expecting recognition in return. There was also a small wooden box tucked into the back of the drawer. She lifted it out carefully, brushing the dust from its lid, and opened it to reveal an assortment of items. Medals from a job well done, a photograph of him standing proudly beside a car she didn't recognize, and a keychain shaped like a wheel. These were tokens of a life much fuller than she had imagined, a life he had chosen to keep hidden. She sat back in the chair, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. How much of him had been unknown to her, even though she had loved him so deeply? How much had he carried silently, never asking anyone to share the burden? The house grew quieter around her as the day wore on. The ticking of the old clock in the living room echoed through the hall, marking time as she lost herself in the pages and fragments. She thought about her own life, the struggles she faced, the loneliness she had felt, the way her family had abandoned her just as they had abandoned him. And in that moment, she felt a bond stretch across the years between them, a recognition that she was not alone in her pain. He had lived it, too, and yet he had endured, leaving behind more than anyone realized. As the sun began to set, she gathered the notebooks and letters into a box, her heart heavy but steady. She could not let these things be thrown away, dismissed as clutter by the same people who had dismissed him. These were treasures, not of money, but of memory and truth. She carried the box into the living room and placed it carefully on the table, a silent promise to herself that she would safeguard it. Her eyes drifted once more toward the back door to the shadow of the garage that loomed beyond. She had not yet stepped inside, but the pull of it grew stronger each day. The notebooks had revealed a side of her grandfather she had never known, but they also hinted at more. Mentions of engines, designs, and machines whispered of secrets that might not be confined to paper. Perhaps the garage held the rest of the story, the part he had locked away from everyone but himself. She stood at the threshold of the back hallway, staring at the door that led outside to where the garage waited. For years, that door had been off limits. Its key kept hidden. Its contents a mystery. She remembered how as a child she would try to follow him when he went there, only for him to turn her back with a firm but gentle hand. She had always wondered what lay inside, imagining dusty boxes and broken tools. But now, after everything she had discovered in his notebooks, she suspected it was something far more significant. The evening air seeped through the cracks of the old house, cool against her skin. She lingered there, torn between fear and curiosity. Entering that garage would mean stepping deeper into his life than she ever had before. It would mean facing truths she might not be ready for, but she knew she could not ignore it forever. The garage was the heart of his secrecy, the place he had guarded most fiercely. Whatever legacy he had left behind was waiting there. She returned to the living room, lighting a small lamp as darkness settled outside. The box of papers sat beside her, a tangible weight of everything she had uncovered so far. She touched it gently, as if touching his hand again, and whispered a quiet promise to herself. She would go into the garage. She would uncover whatever he had left behind. She owed him that much and more. And so the night passed in silence, with her sitting in the dim glow of the lamp, surrounded by the whispers of the house and the unspoken secrets that pressed against the closed door of the garage. She did not yet know the magnitude of what awaited her, but deep in her heart she sensed it. The legacy of her grandfather was not forgotten. It was hidden, waiting for her to find it, to bring it into the light. The night had been long, restless, and filled with the echoes of everything she had uncovered in the house. When dawn finally broke, she rose with heavy eyes, but a firmer resolve than the day before. The notebooks and letters she had gathered seemed to weigh down the table, reminders of how much of her grandfather's life had been hidden in plain sight. But more than the papers, it was the thought of the garage that haunted her now. The door had stood silent for days, waiting, almost daring her to step through. She had put it off, choosing instead to linger in the safer, quieter spaces of the house. Yet she knew that the heart of his secrets had always been locked behind those walls. As she approached the back hallway that morning, the old wood creaking under her steps, the air seemed cooler, heavier. The garage door loomed at the end, its paint cracked, the handle rusted from years of use and neglect. She reached for it and found it locked, just as it always had been. For a moment she felt a surge of disappointment, but then she remembered the small collection of keys she had found in the study the day before. She hurried back to retrieve them, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid them onto the ring, testing each one until finally, with a reluctant groan, the lock gave way. The door opened with a shudder, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of oil, rust, and dust. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The garage was exactly as she had imagined in some ways, and completely different in others. Piles of tools were scattered on benches. Old jars of nails and bolts lined the shelves. Boxes of forgotten items stacked precariously against the walls. The floor was coated in a fine layer of dust and spiderwebs hung from the rafters. It was the kind of place no one had touched in decades, frozen in time, preserved by secrecy. Yet what caught her attention immediately were the two shapes in the far corner. They stood side by side, enormous, hulking forms hidden beneath heavy tarps that sagged with dust. Even from a distance, they seemed purposeful, deliberate, as though her grandfather had placed them there to protect them from curious eyes. She felt her breath catch in her throat. All her childhood memories of being turned away from this place, all the mystery surrounding the garage led to this moment. She hesitated before stepping closer. Every sound seemed amplified, the shuffle of her shoes on the concrete floor, the faint rattle of tools as she brushed past a workbench. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the thudding of her own heartbeat. She reached the first of the covered shapes and stopped, staring at the outline beneath the tarp. It was too sleek, too precise to be ordinary junk. Her hands shook as she reached for the edge of the cover. The fabric resisted at first, stiff with age, but with a sharp tug she pulled it free. Dust billowed into the air, making her cough, but when it cleared, she stood frozen in awe. Before her was a car unlike any she had ever seen in person, its sharp lines and angular body unmistakable even through the years of neglect. A Lamborghini Countach, white beneath the film of dust, its form both alien and beautiful. She had only ever seen such cars in magazines or movies, icons of wealth and power, unreachable dreams for ordinary people. Yet here it was, silent and forgotten, hidden in her grandfather's garage. She walked around it slowly, her hand hovering above the surface, afraid to touch, but unable to resist. The paint had dulled with age. The tires sagged flat against the ground, but the essence of it remained. It was as if the car itself was holding its breath, waiting to be brought back to life. Her mind reeled with questions. How had he acquired it? Why had he kept it hidden? And why had he never told anyone? Her eyes turned then to the second tarp and a deeper sense of anticipation gripped her. If one car had been a miracle, what could the second be? She stepped forward, her palms slick with sweat and seized the edge of the cover. This one came away more easily, sliding to the floor with a heavy thump. The sight that greeted her made her gasp aloud. It was another masterpiece, another legend of the road. A Ferrari. Its red body dulled by years of dust, yet its curves unmistakable. Though worn and tired, it radiated a kind of timeless grace, as though it had been waiting patiently for her to uncover it. She stood motionless, staring, hardly believing her eyes. The Ferrari 250 GTO, so rare, so coveted that collectors around the world would give fortunes for it. And it had been here, hidden under a tarp in the corner of her grandfather's garage, while the family mocked him as a useless old man. Tears welled in her eyes, not only from the shock of discovery, but from the realization of what it meant. He had carried this secret his entire life, guarding it against a family that would have sold it without a second thought. He had trusted no one. Yet perhaps deep down he had known she would be the one to find it. She sat down on an old stool nearby, her legs too weak to hold her. The cars stood before her like monuments, silent proof of a man no one truly understood. The notebooks, the letters, the sketches, they had all hinted at this, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. Her grandfather had been far more than the world believed. He had preserved treasures hidden not only for their value, but perhaps as symbols of something greater, something he wanted to keep untouched by greed. As she stared at them, she noticed a small metal cabinet against the wall, its drawers slightly ajar. Rising to her feet, she opened them one by one, finding documents neatly arranged inside. Registration papers, insurance slips, maintenance records, all meticulously kept, as if he had been preparing for this moment of revelation. There were even photographs of him standing proudly beside the cars in their prime, smiling in a way she had rarely seen. He had loved them, perhaps not only for their beauty, but for what they represented: achievement, independence, pride. The longer she stood there, the clearer it became to her that this garage was more than a storage space. It was a sanctuary, a place where he had hidden not just objects, but a part of himself. The rest of the family had never cared to see beyond their own narrow vision. But here, in the quiet of the garage, she was finally seeing the truth. He had been a man of passion, of dreams, of secrets worth keeping. She lingered there until the light from the small window grew dim. The cars cast in long shadows across the concrete floor. Though exhaustion pressed upon her, she felt strangely alive. Her heart beating with a mixture of sorrow and exhilaration. The world outside might never have respected her grandfather, but she did. And now she had proof, tangible, undeniable proof that his life had been far richer than anyone imagined. When she finally stepped back towards the door, she looked once more at the covered shapes now partially revealed, their gleaming forms waiting to be restored. She pulled the tarps back up to shield them again, her hands gentle, almost reverent. It felt like closing a chapter of a book she would soon return to read again. She locked the garage carefully, slipping the key into her pocket, her mind swirling with thoughts. That night, as she lay awake in the quiet house, she replayed every moment in her mind. The notebooks, the letters, the cars, each piece fitting together into a portrait of a man the others had never truly known. And she knew this was only the beginning. There was more to uncover, more to understand. The garage had given her a glimpse into the forgotten legacy of her grandfather. And now it was her duty to carry it forward. The world outside still mocked, still dismissed, but she no longer cared. She had seen the truth. She had touched it. And in that truth, she found not only her grandfather's strength, but her own. The night after she uncovered the hidden treasures in the garage was one of the longest of her life. Sleep evaded her, though her body begged for rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw them again. The sharp angular lines of the Lamborghini, the graceful curves of the Ferrari, they appeared in her mind like specters glowing beneath the thin film of dust that covered them. She tossed and turned, her heart racing with questions. How long had they been there? Why had he never told anyone? And most of all, why had he chosen to keep them hidden rather than share the truth of what he possessed? When the dawn finally broke, she felt as though she had aged years in a single night. Yet her mind was alive, restless, determined. The discovery in the garage had altered something inside her. It was no longer just about grief or obligation. She had stepped into a part of her grandfather's life that no one else had ever seen, and it had shaken her to her core. The man her relatives had mocked as useless, the man they had abandoned in his final years had carried within him a secret that spoke of pride, knowledge, and vision. Now she was the only one left to carry it forward. The kitchen felt colder than usual that morning as she brewed herself a cup of coffee. The silence of the house seemed heavier, the tick of the clock louder, as though even the walls were waiting to hear what she would do next. She sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, staring toward the back hallway that led to the garage. The key she had used the night before lay beside her, glinting faintly in the morning light. It was no ordinary key now. It was the bridge between the past her grandfather had lived in secret and the future that was now laid at her feet. Her heart beat faster as she returned to the garage. The air inside greeted her once again with its blend of oil, dust, and time. The tarps lay where she had replaced them, shielding the cars as if guarding them from unworthy eyes. She approached the first one slowly, her fingers brushing along the edge of the fabric, tracing the contours beneath. The Lamborghini was more than just a machine. It was a statement, a piece of history. She pulled the tarp back again, this time with deliberate care, letting the light fall across its frame. Up close, she could see the details she had missed the night before. The once bright paint was dulled, but its color still gleamed faintly beneath the dust. The tires sagged, but the rims hinted at their original brilliance. She peered through the window into the interior where leather seats had cracked with age, but still carried an aura of luxury. Her breath caught as she realized she was staring at something very few people would ever touch. This was not just a car. It was a legacy, and it had belonged to her grandfather. Her hands shook as she lifted the door handle. It resisted at first, but with a groan it opened, and the scent of aged leather and metal filled her nose. She lowered herself into the seat, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The wheel was cold under her fingers, the dashboard, a testament to another era. She closed her eyes for a moment, imagining what it must have been like for him to sit here, perhaps in silence, perhaps with the engine roaring to life, carrying him into a world that the rest of the family could never have understood. A sudden wave of emotion swept over her. She thought of how they had laughed at him, how they had sneered when she spent her savings to give him a decent farewell. None of them knew this. None of them would ever understand the man who had chosen to keep these machines hidden. Hidden, preserved not for the greedy, but for the worthy. She realized then that he had not trusted anyone with this secret, and perhaps for good reason. If her relatives had known, they would have stripped the garage bare, sold the cars for quick profit and discarded everything else. But he had kept it hidden. He had protected it. And now, by fate or by design, it was hers to find. She sat in the car for what felt like hours, her thoughts spinning, her heart caught between grief and awe. At last, she climbed out, letting the door close gently behind her. Her eyes drifted to the second tarp, where the Ferrari waited. She had not dared to linger with it the night before, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she had seen. But now she knew she had to. Slowly, reverently, she pulled the cover away once more, unveiling the crimson body that gleamed even through the years of dust. The Ferrari was different from the Lamborghini. Where the Countach screamed of angles and edges, of futuristic daring, the GTO whispered of elegance, of beauty shaped into steel. Its form was softer, but no less commanding. She circled it slowly, drinking in every curve, every line. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass of the window as though the car itself was inviting her to step closer to become part of its story. She opened the door and peered inside. The seats were worn. The dashboard cracked, but the soul of the car remained untouched. She could almost hear the echo of an engine that had once thundered down roads she could only dream of. She imagined her grandfather sitting here, his hands on the wheel, his eyes alight with the joy of something that was truly his. And for the first time she understood these cars were not trophies or possessions. They were pieces of him, extensions of his spirit, and perhaps the truest reflection of the life he had lived in secret. Her gaze wandered toward the metal cabinet against the wall where she had found the documents the night before. She opened it again, pulling out more folders, her heart racing as she read through them. Each page confirmed what she had already begun to suspect. He had bought the Lamborghini decades ago, investing in it when it was still new, perhaps as part of some venture he had never spoken about. The Ferrari's papers told another story, one that stretched back even further to a time when he had been young, bold, and unafraid of risk. The documents were meticulous, carefully preserved, as though he had known that someday someone would come looking. She found receipts for parts, maintenance logs, even photographs of the cars in their prime. And in those photographs was her grandfather, smiling, standing proudly beside them. She held one of the photos to her chest, tears streaming down her face. This was the man she remembered, the man she had loved. But now he seemed so much larger, so much greater than she had ever known. As the day wore on, she remained in the garage, surrounded by the dust and the silence. Her hands covered in dirt and her heart full of wonder. The world outside had dismissed him. But here, in this space he had guarded so carefully, she had found the truth. He was not a man who had wasted his life. He was not a burden to be mocked. He was a keeper of dreams, a guardian of treasures, and now his legacy lived on through her. When at last she left the garage, locking the door behind her, she carried with her not only the key, but a new sense of purpose. The discovery had changed her. She was no longer just the granddaughter who had buried him while the rest of the family sneered. She was the inheritor of his secret, the one chosen by fate, by love, or by his quiet trust to carry his story forward. And she would not let his legacy be forgotten. That night, lying awake in the house that still smelled of him, she knew that the journey was only beginning. The first discovery had opened her eyes, but there were still more questions, more truths to be uncovered. Her grandfather had left her the pieces of a puzzle, and now it was her task to put them together. The cars were not the end. They were the beginning. The weight of the discoveries pressed on her for days after she first pulled away the tarps in the garage. Every time she closed her eyes, the images returned with clarity so sharp it felt almost unreal. The angular defiance of the Lamborghini, the graceful red form of the Ferrari. She had touched them, sat inside them, smelled the leather and dust that had held decades of silence. But still, part of her could hardly believe they were real. And yet they were there, hidden behind the locked door of the garage, waiting for her each morning like sleeping giants, silent guardians of her grandfather's secret. The house felt different now. Where before it had been heavy with grief and emptiness, now it thrummed with tension, with possibility. Each drawer, each faded paper, seemed a whisper of more, as if the house itself was guiding her toward a truth long buried. She woke earlier each day, restless, and filled with an urgency she could not explain. The ordinary tasks of life, cooking, cleaning, resting, fell away. Her thoughts always circled back to the garage, to the cabinet of papers, to the sense that she had only uncovered the surface of something much deeper. On a gray morning, the kind that wrapped the neighborhood in mist, she returned once more to the garage with a box in her hands. It was the box of notebooks and letters she had gathered from the study, the words her grandfather had left behind, the fragments of his mind. She felt instinctively that they belonged here in the space where his secrets had been guarded most fiercely. She placed the box on the workbench, the old wood groaning under the weight, and began leafing through the papers again, this time with new eyes. In the margins of diagrams and sketches, she began to see patterns she had missed before. Numbers and dates matched those she found in the car documents, references to parts, to maintenance, even to racing events. It was as though her grandfather had been keeping two lives, one visible to the world, humble and quiet, and one hidden, full of machines and motion and pride. The notebooks told stories that no one else had ever read. Stories of nights spent tuning engines, of near misses and victories, of dreams set aside when responsibility had demanded silence. Her fingers trembled as she pulled a thin folder from the back of the box. It was different from the others, the paper thicker, the handwriting sharper, more deliberate. Inside were photographs, black and white at first, then colored with age. She saw him younger, standing beside the Lamborghini when its paint still gleamed like snow, smiling in a way she barely recognized. Another showed him leaning against the Ferrari, his hand on the roof, his expression one of quiet triumph. There were others, too. Crowds, racetracks, people shaking his hand. She had never seen these moments, never known this side of him. Beneath the photographs were letters that struck her even harder. Some were invitations to events. Others were contracts written with companies whose names she recognized even if she knew little of their history. He had been part of something greater once, something far beyond the modest life he had lived in the end. The realization made her chest tighten with both sorrow and pride. The man they had dismissed, the man they had ridiculed as useless, had carried a history they would never comprehend. He had walked among worlds they could not imagine, and then he had locked those worlds away, letting them gather dust in his garage. She set the letters down and turned again to the cars, her eyes lingering on their faded glory. The Ferrari drew her more that day, its red body dulled, but still defiant. She ran her hand along the curve of the hood, brushing away dust until the paint shone faintly beneath. She crouched to examine the tires, cracked with age, and then rose to peer into the interior again. The wheel felt different under her hand. This time, not just cold steel and leather, but a symbol, a connection to a man she had only half known. Her gaze fell on the glove compartment, and she leaned inside to open it. To her surprise, it was not empty. A small envelope sat tucked within, yellowed and brittle with time. Her name was not on it, but her grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she slid it open, pulling out a folded letter. The words inside made her breath catch. He had written not for anyone in particular, perhaps for himself, perhaps for the one who would one day find it. In the letter he spoke of his choices, of how he had built a life in silence because the noise of others had grown too cruel. He admitted he had hidden the cars not just to protect them, but to protect himself from the greed and mockery of those who could never understand. He spoke of trust, of how he had come to believe that in the end it would not be his children or their children who would honor him, but the one person who had always looked at him with respect rather than contempt. Her eyes blurred with tears as she read, realizing he had known somehow that she would be the one to uncover all this. He had not named her, but his words carried the weight of a truth she could feel in her bones. He had left these treasures, this legacy for her, not for wealth, not for glory, but for remembrance, so that someone would see him as he truly was, not as the caricature her family had painted. She pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes, breathing deeply to steady herself. The garage no longer felt like a place of shadows, but a revelation of intimacy. She was closer to him here than she had ever been while he was alive. It was as though his silence had finally broken. His secrets finally spoken, even if only through ink on faded paper and machines covered in dust. The rest of the day blurred as she moved between the cars. The documents, and the memories. She opened compartments, rifled through boxes, piecing together the puzzle of who he had been. The second discovery was not just the Ferrari itself, but the story it carried, the truth he had left sealed away for decades. She realized now that the cars were not only valuable in money, but invaluable as proof of a life lived fully, even if quietly, defiantly against those who had doubted him. As night fell again, she sat on the cold concrete floor of the garage, the letter in her lap, the cars towering over her like sentinels. The hum of the world outside seemed distant, irrelevant. Here she was not the abandoned granddaughter, not the woman mocked for caring too much. Here she was the keeper of his legacy, the heir not to fortune alone, but to truth, to memory, to pride. She rose slowly, locking the garage behind her once more, the key warm in her hand. The house welcomed her back with its silence, but it no longer felt oppressive. It felt full, alive, carrying her grandfather's presence in every corner. And in her heart a new resolve took shape. She would not let the secret die. She would not let his name be trampled under the laughter of those who had never known him. She would carry this forward for him, for herself, for the truth. The second discovery had given her more than answers. It had given her purpose. The letter lay on her nightstand that evening, its creased paper still carrying the weight of her grandfather's hand. She had read it countless times since pulling it from the Ferrari's glove compartment, each word etched into her mind. It was not long or flowery, but it was honest, the kind of honesty that stripped away the years of silence and let her see him clearly at last. He had not been a man who gave up as others claimed. He had not wasted his life. He had chosen to protect what was dear to him, guarding his treasures from those who would have destroyed them for their own gain. And now with him gone, it was she who held the key to all of it, literally in the form of the metal key heavy in her pocket, and figuratively in the trust he had placed in her without ever saying it aloud. The morning light came soft and muted, filtering through the curtains as though reluctant to disturb the house. She woke with the weight of her grandfather's legacy pressing against her chest, but it was no longer a burden. It was something steadier, almost like armor, a strength she had not known she carried until now. She rose and walked slowly through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photographs, the small relics of a life that seemed so much more vibrant in death than it had ever been allowed to appear in life. Each room now felt like a chapter in his story, and she was no longer merely grieving. She was reading him, learning him, discovering who he truly was. Her thoughts turned inevitably to the garage again. She knew she could not leave the cars under tarps forever, as though keeping them hidden would preserve his secret. Secrets were fragile things, and she understood now that he had not intended for them to remain buried after he was gone. He had left breadcrumbs, notes, letters, photographs, and in doing so, he had ensured that she and only she would find them. He wanted her to know, to carry the truth forward, to stand tall in the face of those who had mocked him. She returned to the garage with renewed purpose. The air was no different, still tinged with oil and dust, but her eyes saw it through a different lens. Now, where before there had been mystery and tension, now there was reverence. The Lamborghini and the Ferrari stood like monuments to his will, guardians of his unspoken legacy. She approached them with a quiet smile, no longer trembling with shock, but steadied by recognition. These were not just machines. They were symbols, proof that he had lived a life worth remembering. On the workbench, the notebook still sat in their neat stack, her own handwriting now joining his in the margins as she tried to make sense of his calculations. She knew she would never fully grasp the technical precision he had left behind, but she also knew that was not the point. The notebooks were not meant to be blueprints for machines or guides to riches. They were the remnants of his passion, the proof of a mind that had never stopped searching, building, dreaming. She traced her fingers over his notes and whispered a thank you, not sure if she was speaking to him, to herself, or to the silence that held them both. The day passed slowly as she continued to sift through every corner of the garage. She opened boxes, checked drawers, lifted tarps from old crates. Each discovery was small but meaningful. A set of tools worn smooth by his hands. A photograph of him standing beside a car in a racetrack, a journal entry where he described the hum of an engine as though it were music. She began to realize that what he had left her was not simply wealth or the possibility of selling the cars for money. He had left her the story of who he was, woven into every detail, every object, every scrap of paper. By evening she stood once again before the two cars, the fading light casting them in long shadows. She imagined them restored, gleaming once more under the sun, engines roaring to life after decades of silence. The thought made her chest ache with both longing and pride. She knew she could sell them, that they would bring more money than she could ever dream of, enough to secure her future, to free her from the financial worries that had plagued her since his death. But she also knew she could not do it. Not yet. To sell them now would be to reduce them to numbers, to strip them of the story he had hidden so carefully. They were more than commodities. They were his voice, his truth, his defiance against a family that had abandoned him. She thought of those relatives, the ones who had sneered when she spent her last savings to bury him with dignity, the ones who had dismissed him as nothing. They would never know this. They would never see the treasure he had guarded, never understand the magnitude of his silence. A part of her wanted to confront them, to reveal the truth, and watch their faces collapse with regret and envy. But another part of her, the deeper, quieter part, knew that was not what he would have wanted. He had chosen her for a reason. He had trusted her to honor him, not to use his legacy as a weapon against those who had wronged him. So she made her decision there in the fading light of the garage, the dust swirling like smoke around her. She would not rush to sell, not rush to expose. She would restore the cars one day at a time, bringing them back to life as a testament to him. She would preserve the notebooks, the letters, the photographs, creating a record of who he had been for herself and for the future. His legacy would not be squandered or mocked. It would be honored, cherished, guarded, just as he had guarded it all those years. When she finally left the garage that night, locking it carefully behind her, the weight in her heart was no longer grief, but resolve. The house welcomed her back with its familiar silence, but even the silence felt different now. It was not empty. It was full of him, full of the life he had lived and the truth he had left for her to find. She sat in his chair, the letter once more in her hands. And for the first time since his death, she felt at peace. Not because the pain had gone, but because it had been transformed into something greater. Her grandfather had been mocked, dismissed, forgotten by those who should have cherished him. But through his secrets, through the treasures he had hidden, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that he had never been what they claimed. He had been strong, brilliant, passionate, and proud. And now, through her, his story would not end. It would live on, not in whispers of cruelty, but in the roar of engines, in the turning of pages, in the memory of a man who had trusted his granddaughter to see him as he truly was. She leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes, and whispered softly into the quiet room. "I will carry this, I promise." And in that moment, with the night pressing gently against the windows and the house cradling her in its silence, she knew that she was no longer alone. His legacy was hers, and through her, it would never die. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss our next unbelievable stories. Check out the next video waiting for you right here. Each one is even more shocking than the last. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family so they can experience it, too.